There is a phone number you haven't dialed in a long time. You know exactly whose it is. Every few months, something brings them to mind. A song, the way October light falls through a window, the smell of coffee at a certain hour. You think, I should call. You don't. Not because anything happened. Not because you stopped caring. But somewhere along the way, without either of you deciding it, the calling stopped. And then the silence became the default. And then you stopped counting how long it had been. If you've passed 65, you know exactly what this feels like. Not grief, not quite, regret, not yet. Something quieter than both of those. The low hum of something unfinished. What I want to share with you today comes from one of the longest-running studies on human happiness ever conducted. After following the same people for over 80 years, researchers found that one specific behavior, not a supplement, not an exercise routine, not a diet, turned out to be the strongest predictor of who stayed mentally sharp, emotionally resilient, and genuinely satisfied with their lives well into their 80s. Almost everyone stops doing it after 70. Almost no one realizes they've stopped. Stay with me for the next 10 minutes, because by the end, a name is going to come to you, and you'll know exactly what to do with it. Wendell is 71 years old. He taught high school history for 34 years in a mid-sized town in Ohio. Kind of teacher students came back to visit years later. The kind who stayed after the final bell because the conversation wasn't finished yet. He retired 4 years ago. Every morning now, he makes himself a proper breakfast. Eggs, toast, a sliced tomato arranged on the side of the plate, not for presentation, just habit. He eats it standing at the kitchen counter, looking out at the bird feeder he hung last spring, the one his daughter helped him fill on the first afternoon, and hasn't mentioned since. He is not lonely in the way people picture loneliness. He has a routine. He reads. He walks. He knows the names of most of his neighbors and the names of 2 of their dogs. But there is a name in his phone, a man named Ray, another teacher, his closest colleague for 17 years, and Wendell hasn't called him in over 2 years. Not because of a falling out, not because of anything said, just because one of them stopped initiating. And then, slowly, the other did too. And now, the number sits there the way an unread letter sits on a table, present, quiet, easier not to touch. Wendell tells himself he'll call when he has something real to say, something worth the interruption. But here is what nobody tells you about waiting for the right moment. Sometimes, the waiting itself becomes the answer, not the one you chose. The one that chose you quietly while you were busy with other things. Retention hook in a few minutes. I'll tell you what 80 years of Harvard research found about people exactly like Wendell, and why it might change how you think about that name in your phone. But first, why do we stop calling in the first place? It doesn't happen all at once. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to stop being the one who reaches out. It happens the way a path in a garden disappears gradually under the slow accumulation of small, reasonable reasons. You're tired. You don't want to intrude. You tell yourself they have their own life, their own family pulling at them from every direction. And underneath all of that, quieter than any of those thoughts, is something you might not even let yourself name. The fear of being too much. Or worse, the fear that you've already waited so long that calling now would only draw attention to how long the silence has been. So you don't, and they don't either. And a year becomes 2 years, becomes a distance with no clear path back. Researchers who study social behavior in adults over 60 have found something almost counterintuitive. The older we get, the more we tend to wait for others to initiate, even when we are the ones who most want connection. We pull inward, not out of indifference, but out of something that looks a great deal like courtesy, a quiet, practiced sense of not imposing ourselves on someone else's already full life. The result is devastating in its quietness. Two people who genuinely miss each other can go years without speaking, both assuming the other has moved on, neither one knowing the other still checks that name sometimes, still thinks of a joke they would have appreciated, still has the number saved under exactly the right contact photo. That is not distance. That is a closed door with both people standing on the same side of it. There is a particular kind of afternoon that arrives more often after 70. The tasks are done. The house is quiet. You've had your coffee, read the news, watered whatever needs watering, and you sit down, maybe by a window, maybe at the kitchen table with nothing in front of you, and you feel the weight of time that isn't spoken for. Not boredom, not sadness. Something closer to the awareness that the afternoon is very long, and no one knows quite what you're doing in it. And in that moment, there is usually a face that comes to mind. Not a category of person. A specific person, someone you shared something real with. A decade working side by side. A particular summer. A friendship that formed the way the best ones do, slowly, without announcement, until one day it was simply there and you couldn't remember the world before it. And you think, they're probably busy. They have their own life. I shouldn't interrupt. That thought, repeated enough times, becomes a cage that looks exactly like consideration. Here is what the research into social connection and aging consistently shows, and this is not a small finding. It is one of the most replicated results in the field. It is not the quantity of contact that matters most to our health and mental sharpness as we age. It is whether the contact feels chosen. Whether you are in someone's life because you decided to be, actively, on purpose, rather than simply because you haven't yet fallen out of it. The difference between those two things is enormous. One is presence. The other is just proximity. And after 70, many people confuse them. They assume that because someone is technically still in their life, the annual card, the occasional text, the connection is intact. Sometimes it is, but sometimes what looks like a relationship from the outside is actually two people maintaining the appearance of one, each quietly hoping the other will close the gap. Each quietly certain that waiting is the polite thing to do. Each waiting. The Harvard study of adult development is one of the longest-running studies on happiness and aging ever conducted. Researchers followed hundreds of people across their entire adult lives, tracking health, relationships, mental sharpness, and what the subjects themselves described as a life that felt worth living. And when the findings came in, after decades of following these same people into their 80s and beyond, the results were not what the researchers had expected when the study began. It was not wealth, not physical health, though that mattered, not career history, not retirement security, not whether they lived in a city or a small town near the water. The single strongest predictor of who stayed sharp, who remained emotionally grounded, who described their lives as genuinely good, was the quality of their close relationships, not the number of people around them. The depth and the numbers behind this are striking. People who had at least one close, honest relationship in their 70s, someone they could be fully truthful with, without performing fine when they weren't, were significantly more likely to remain cognitively sharp into their 80s. The gap was not small. In some measures, the difference in cognitive decline between those with deep connection and those without was larger than the difference between lifelong smokers and non-smokers. One relationship, not a wide social network, not a wide, full calendar. One person who knew how you actually sounded when something hurt. That was enough to change the trajectory. Here is the part that kept appearing in the data, the part that surprised even the people running the study. Among those with the deepest, most sustaining connections, the ones who were still mentally engaged and emotionally alive, well into their 80s, there was a consistent pattern in how they behaved. They were the ones who initiated, Not always, not perfectly, but consistently. Over time, they were the ones who made the call. Who wrote the letter, back when writing letters was what you did? Who showed up at the door? Who did not wait for the other person to go first, or for conditions to be ideal, or for a reason good enough to justify reaching out after a long silence? They understood, maybe without ever putting it into words, that connection does not maintain itself. It needs tending, and tending requires someone to begin. Wendell called Ray on a Tuesday morning in late October. He'd been at the counter, eating his breakfast, watching a small bird he couldn't name land on the feeder and sit there, completely unbothered, and something in him just moved. He had an explanation ready, something reasonable, something that would make the silence sound shorter than it actually was. Ray picked up on the second ring. "I was just thinking about you," Ray said. That was it. No accounting for the gap. No explanation needed. 2 years of quiet dissolved in about 40 seconds, not because the distance hadn't been real, but because it turned out the distance had been mutual. And mutual things can be closed from either side. They talked for an hour and 20 minutes. Wendell's breakfast went cold on the counter. He didn't notice until much later. It was, he thought to himself, that afternoon, rinsing the plate, looking out at the bird feeder, one of the best mornings he'd had in years, not because anything dramatic had happened, because something ordinary had been restored. You don't need a reason to call someone you've been thinking about. That might sound obvious, but for a lot of people who grew up in a world where you didn't impose, where you waited to be invited, where keeping your feelings to yourself was considered a form of respect, it is not obvious at all. It goes against a whole lifetime of quiet, practiced restraint. And the older we get, the easier it becomes to believe that the window has closed, that too much time has passed. That calling now would only remind both of you of how long it's been silent. But the data keeps saying the same thing across different studies, different decades, different countries. Most of the people you've lost touch with would still answer if you called. Most of them are carrying the same quiet thought. You are just standing on their side of the same closed door. The difference between people who feel genuinely connected in their 70s and 80s and those who feel untethered, it is rarely about how interesting someone is, rarely about how much they have to offer, almost never about whether anyone actually wants to hear from them. It is almost always about who decided to go first. Think of someone right now, not a category, a specific person. Someone whose voice you would recognize from across a noisy room. Someone whose name may have already come to you during this video, and you let it arrive, and you let it pass. You have their number. The conversation doesn't need to explain the silence. It doesn't need to be long. It just needs to begin. 2 words, said aloud into a phone you haven't picked up in too long. I called. Is there someone whose name came to you during this video? You don't have to share it here if you're not ready for that. But if you did reach out, or if you're sitting with this and still deciding I'd genuinely like to know, leave me a word in the comments. Even just a name. If that's all you want to say, I read every one. If something in this brought you a moment of quiet today, or helped you find words for something you'd been carrying without a name for it, I'd be glad to have you here for the next one. I think it's worth your time.